And now that we have gotten through these logistics, I am thrilled to introduce our presenters today. Joe Feldman has worked in education for over 20 years as a teacher, principal, and district administrator, and is the founder and CEO of Crescendo Education Group, which since 2013 has supported K-12 schools, districts, and colleges and universities nationwide to improve grading and assessment practices. He leads the Equitable Grading Project, has presented at numerous education conferences, and his writings have been published in Education Week, CAPN, Education Leadership, District Administrator, and Black Press USA. Joe is the author of Grading for Equity, What It Is, Why It Matters, and How It Can Transform Schools and Classrooms, a book that has sold nearly 200,000 copies worldwide since the first edition was released in 2018. Joe is joined today by his colleague, Dr. Shantha Smith. In her role as Crescendo Education Group's Director of Facilitation, Dr. Smith leads equitable grading workshops, provides coaching to leaders and teachers, develops curriculum, and supports talent development of the Crescendo Education team. Dr. Smith holds a BA in Special Education, a Master's of Education in Curriculum and Instruction, a PhD in Special Education and Special Education Leadership. Dr. Smith most recently was an instructional leader and Equity and Excellence Coordinator in Northern Virginia, and is the 2020 recipient of Virginia's Mary Peak Award for Excellence in Education Equity. For over 20 years, she has served as an advocate for students of color to reimagine schools that support all learners. So I'm going to hand it over to Joe and Dr. Smith. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Melissa. And on behalf of Dr. Smith and myself, we just want to thank Corwin and the Corwin team for putting this together and supporting this really important conversation. And both from the first edition and with the second edition now, Corwin's just been such a great partner for me in all of this work. So welcome everyone from all over. We are so excited to be spending some time with you today, talking about what have we learned in the last 5 years about grading for equity. I'm going to introduce myself very quickly, a little bit more, and sort of weave into the story of sort of how did I get interested in this work in the first place, and then how Dr. Smith did the same and how we met. And then we'll get into some of the good conversation. So as Melissa said, I'm a former teacher and high school principal, administrator, and back in the probably 2011-12, I stopped working in a district and started just exploring, talking with lots of folks and researching this nagging issue of grading. It was something that I never quite felt I had a handle on. And when I started researching it, I found that grading has a very rich history in the United States. And when I started looking at related fields of culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogy and motivation theory and adolescent development, found that in many ways, the practices that we often use in our classroom are inherited from 100 years ago and are undermining a lot of our work. And started talking with some more administrators and some more teachers and researching more, and found this research and evidence that we could grade differently in more equitable ways. And so started partnering with schools and districts. From what I learned in those conversations and those experiences, published Grading for Equity in 2018. So it was all based on real experiences of teachers and students who started to experience these more equitable practices. And then I met Dr. Smith, who will now introduce herself.
Hello, hello, hello. I am so excited to see people from all over the nation. In the world. I saw Japan in the house, and Canada, everywhere. So I'm very excited to be here with you all today. And a bit about me. I met Joe on Twitter, true story. Actually met Joe before the pandemic. Joe sent me a message on Twitter because, like many of you may have experienced in your career in education, your principal comes and gives you a book and say, "Hey, I want to do this." And you're like, okay. So when she gave me the book, I had no idea that it would change not only the lives of my students and my colleagues, but also my life personally, being able to share this work all over the nation. And so in my work as an instructional coach and in the equity and excellence space, I was able to help begin this process in my middle school. So that's a little bit about me.
So when I started to be Dr. Smith, I was starting the organization of Crescendo Education Group. And with the publication of the book, and then during the pandemic, a lot of interest really exploded in exploring grading. And now, as an organization, we partner with schools and districts across the country, and this is just a subset, but you'll see it's independent schools, it's large public school districts, it's small ones, it's rural, in urban context, it's charter schools, as well as universities and colleges whose faculties are very interested in this work as well for their teachers. And yet it can be very isolating to do this work. And so we invite you to connect with us through all these different ways. But please, it's really important that people understand that this is part of a large movement of teachers who are trying to align the ways that they teach with the ways that they grade and why they went into education in the first place. So with that, I'm going to pass the baton back to Dr. Smith, who's going to kind of lay out a little bit of what this is and what this isn't, and set the stage for us a bit.
So before we go into what was equitable grading like before spring 2020, I'm just going to do a little bit of stage setting and let you know this isn't a complete and full what, why, and how of equitable grading. In this session, we do have other ways to educate and teach people about that want a deeper dive through our book study or our intro to equitable grading through our online course. But we want to have this conversation about what have we learned. And so with that, thinking about what was equitable grading before spring 2020. And so interesting enough, I started this work in 2018. And so I'm going to share my personal story. In 2018, when my principal handed me the book, Dr. Lori Wiggins, I said, okay, we're going to work with our leaders. And it came at a pivotal time in our work because before that, I had spent about 5 years in my school working with teachers, helping to reduce our achievement gap. And I did that through culturally sustaining pedagogy and instruction, working with high leverage practices in the classroom. And that did move the needle. We were able to reduce the achievement gaps and see some better outcomes for our students with disabilities, for our English language learners. But then we kind of hit this plateau and entered the book, right? It was almost like divine. It was like the next step because it was like, aha, we've changed some of our instructional practices, but one major thing hasn't changed, which are the structures that are inherently embedded into our system. And it was grading. And I had never thought about it in this way before. I think intuitively as educators, we're making tweaks to the system and I'm doing things, moving to standards, and I'm just doing things that I think are in the best interest of students. But this book was so affirming and gave me the language about what it means to really give students opportunities to be engaged in the learning. So I think what's really important to highlight here is that while the pandemic really I think really put a stress test on the system. It really exacerbated an already existing problem because in my personal case, we knew that there were problems with our system. And so when we got the book, it was like a light bulb moment and seeing the pillars outlined, it was like those are our guiding lights. And we use those pillars to really help and support us move this work forward. And so you might ask, well, what is the equitable grading framework? And the book really has 3 pillars. And the 3 pillars that I used as our teachers in my school use that we consider the guiding light is that we want our grades to be an accurate reflection of what students know and can do. We want it to reflect students' academic performance. Also, we want grades that are bias resistant, meaning we want them to counteract institutional biases and prevent our implicit biases from affecting our grades. And last, but certainly not least, we want grades that are motivational. We want to build students' intrinsic motivation, self-regulation, and sense of efficacy. And so those are the pillars or the framework that we use as the guiding light. And in the book, there's a part where Joe even talks about this as the 4th pillar of coherence. We might not all be doing the same thing, but we're using these pillars to really help move the work forward across this nation.
All right. And as Dr. Smith said, like this work is very deep and complex. And for those folks who have read the book, you know that there's so many aspects to this and all the research that supports it. But we're going to kind of go past a lot of that today. We're just going to narrowly talk about the spring of 2020 the spring of 2020 and why and what does it mean for us now? So when the pandemic hit, it sort of froze us all in our tracks, as we may remember. And people started to really change a lot of aspects of schools, and they had to. They really had no choice. And I want to talk about some of the specific changes that were made to grading specifically. So we saw a trend in school and district policies that they, rather than adopt an A, B, C, D, F, or even sort of percentages scale, they approached it very in a binary way, right? It was either going to be pass or fail. Or in some cases, they would say it's either pass or not yet met or incomplete because it was such a tumultuous time in that second semester. Others districts also and schools decided to do things where rather than what they had done, which is that sort of incorporate attendance into the grade, right? If you didn't attend a certain number of days, you were automatically failing or it was somehow computed into the calculation of the grade. The districts and schools suspended that aspect. So it wasn't dependent on you attending every time the class met by Zoom. At the teacher and classroom level, we saw some other kind of pivots. One was this acceptance of late work, right? The deadlines got a little more flexible and fluid under the circumstances. And teachers at first tried to adopt the participation points kinds of ways that have been incorporated into grading where, you know, if you come on time or if you bring your book and it's covered or if you raise your hand or if you have your notebook, those kinds of things. A lot of those were pushed out of the way because when we tried to use those, and many of those are really a classroom management strategy more than a sort of a knowledge description way of using grading, it didn't really make sense in the same kind of way in ways that I'll talk about in just a minute. But we sort of got rid of those kinds of aspects of grading. And really what we started to think about grading being is where the grade would only represent what a student knows about the content of the course, that all these other aspects of grading, it was very difficult to apply those. And it was actually became impossible in many ways because of the world turned upside down. It wasn't like, did you turn on your Zoom camera? Did you, raise your hand? Because we just found those things were just unreliable. The world was in such chaos for so many of us that to incorporate those into the grade seemed inapplicable, if not sort of a fool's errand. And we also started to give our students more opportunities, right? If they couldn't be there on the day of the presentation or they hadn't learned it by the specific time of the assessment, we gave them a little bit more time. So now's the question of, well, so what do we do now? Like, how do we sort of think about what did we learn during that time? And in this rubber band gravitational pull back to normalcy, what do we want to remember? What do we want to sort of not make sure we go back to? And what are the things that we learned that we want to keep in our memory? And what does this mean about the ways that we grade and to be more equitable in that, right? What did we learn? And what do we want to continue to remember? So I want to take a step back and sort of talk about, well, why did we make these kinds of changes to our grading during the pandemic? What are some of the things that happened to us and that we saw and experienced that we want to remember? Well, the first is that we were doing everything through Zoom meetings. We all know, and now we're so good at Zoom meetings. Maybe we're a little rusty for this one, but right, we saw our students through the computer, and we actually didn't just see them abstractly like we see them in our school. We saw them with all of their experiences and their home circumstances behind them, right? We knew we had insight into how noisy or quiet is their house. Do they have younger siblings who they're taking care of? What is the lighting like? What are the other sort of fixtures around their house, right? We saw lots of things that we did not formally have access to. And some might argue we shouldn't have access to, but we got that access. The second thing is that we depended much more on caregivers, parents, guardians, family members of our students to support them in learning much more than we ever had to, right? Some of us had to really like communicate lesson plans and like make sure that the students spent time doing X or Y, right? We needed their help on things. And they got a lot more insight into what do we do? They saw our struggles as teachers. And I think it built a stronger sense of empathy on both sides and respect on both sides. And just sort of kind of opened up a new way that we could relate to them and think about them as partners in a way that we hadn't as much. And the final is, we're talking a lot about the students' experiences, but we had our share as grownups, we had our share of traumatic experiences during the pandemic. And we weren't always at our best, and we couldn't always meet our own deadlines, and we couldn't always teach our classes with the same timelines that we wanted because of the stressors that we were experiencing. And so what this also did is it taught us to be a little more humble in our own work and to extend more grace. We asked for more grace from our administrators and our parents and our students, and they asked that from us too. And I think that is a way of thinking about our own work and ourselves as humans and the people around us as humans, which is so important in this work of teaching and learning. I want to talk about now specific things around grading that we learned because of what we experienced during the global pandemic. The first is, and I referenced this a little bit, is some of the flaws and harms and even absurdity of the traditional grading practices. So, there's in traditional grading, we use points as a behavior management strategy, oftentimes, and not entirely, but in a number of ways. And if we say to students, well, you'll get 10 points if you come to this Zoom meeting, right, to the class today, or 5 minutes if you enter something 5 points if you enter something in the chat, right? There are things going on that were going on in students' lives. We could have offered 1,000,000 points and they still wouldn't have been able to attend. And so it helped us recognize that this extrinsic motivation strategy for behavior management actually may not be so effective for students, particularly when they have lots of other things going on in their lives for which our class and the points that we offer will not change whether or not they're able to engage with us and do what we say. The second thing is the inequities that we saw in resources, in supports, right? We saw that sometimes there would be parents who were always available for our students, and there were other times when there were not parents available because of their own trauma they were experiencing or economic responsibilities or et cetera. And we saw that happening. And so we had to think more carefully about the expectations for our students and how we would support them. And the third is sort of what I call double punishment. So this idea that, if a student doesn't do the homework assignment, then traditionally there's a penalty for that in the grade. And then later in the test, when they don't get that answer right that was related to the homework, they get punished, right? They get the subtraction of points. So when they don't do the homework, they're getting punished twice. Once for not doing the homework, and the second for not learning what was in the homework. And we realized we actually don't have to do that, right? The consequences, and I'm not even going to call it punishment, the consequences for not completing the homework or not doing the homework, those consequences are embedded in the assessment because they're not going to be able to perform that with the level of mastery we want or the level of competence if they don't do the homework. So we sort of realize we don't have to actually double punish. The second, I'll say there's going to be 3 of these. The second is that we learned how valuable it is to be explicit. When I have to communicate expectations for your learning through a computer, I have to be more explicit and more transparent. I can't leave quite as many assumptions and implicitness out there. I gotta emphasize things clearly, concisely, and check for understanding with even the expectations. And that really taught us, like, when we do that, we actually empower students more. The third thing is that if my job as a teacher is to describe a student's level of understanding of the course content, if that's one of the key responsibilities I have, then I'm dependent upon the quality of my assessments in order to do that. And when I had to do assessments through kind of different mechanisms than I had before, right? I couldn't just give the sheet of paper. I had to do things differently, and I had to think more expansively about that. I realized that the better my assessments and the more the more varied they are in the ways that they assess, the more likely that I will get data that I can have confidence accurately describes students' understanding. And so I might want to expand the ways I think about assessment, because I am so dependent on having the assessment be able to ascertain a student's level of understanding. So that's some of the things we learned in the pandemic. But we also had other, big reckonings around the Black Lives Matter movement. This was happening at the same time. And it's hard to remember that this huge sort of phase in our history happened at the same time as the pandemic. And what was happening then for us is that we saw through videos and a string of events, police brutality against Black people that had been happening for a long time, but it was so visible and we were so glued to the documentation in front of us. And it was a reckoning that this actually creates a moral imperative for white people and others to do something about it. And it actually wasn't just, the violence wasn't just happening in this very sort of visceral, visually explicit way, but there were harms that were being done in other institutions, including our schools. And this role of educators in schools meant that we had an obligation to start critically examining the ways that our schools functioned and some of the systems and operations of our schools that were causing harms to Black students in particular and other students of color. And we have to counteract that. And grading is one of those systems, of course. And it sort of helped us understand that traditional grading practices have always harmed our historically vulnerable students, specifically Black students. But during the pandemic, we were seeing that these harms were being exacted for all students because we were all now so much more vulnerable to our life circumstances, right? And in fact, the flip side of this is if we can better understand how to correct these structural racist systems in the schools, it actually benefits everybody. Just like the harms that were being done to historically underserved students actually affect everybody. When we address the harms through the narrow lens and look at what will make the lives of Black students better in our schools and give them more opportunities, it actually can benefit everybody. So what were the main things we need to remember? That grades need to be accurate. That is the most important. They have to accurately describe what students know. We have to be bias resistant, right? We have to counteract the institutional systemic issues that are happening in our school and outside in the ways that we grade and manage and control for our own biases. And we have to think about motivation differently. We're not going to use grades to manage and measure compliance, right? We want grades to be motivating to students. So it's not just an endless quest for accumulating points, but what can we tap into that actually gives students more motivation to be successful and to believe in their own efficacy and agency? And that when we create more equitable systems in our grading and for anything, but in our grading in particular, we can benefit everybody. Dr. Smith, anything to add to this before I move on?
I'll just add that I think for me, I really want us to remember it was easy for us to, because we were snatched out of the system and the cogwheel, I will say, we were taken out of that so abruptly and entered into a new space. It gave us an opportunity to see through a different lens and really to honor people's humanity. And I think that through this work, and we are having an opportunity to honor not only our own humanity in schools, but also the humanity of our students. So I think that is one of the things we certainly should remember. And through more equitable grading practices, we're able to do that, to acknowledge that.
And I think for a lot of us, we now better recognize that we're trying to get off and out of these traditional grading systems, right? We're trying to get off this bad structure. It seems kind of scary because we're not totally sure like what this new direction is that we're going in, but we can't go back to normal. Like that normal, we understand how harmful it is and how undermining it is of our own work. So we got to get off that and go into new territory.
And change is scary. I like to say everybody wants change until they have to change because it creates a lot of work. Change is not easy. And so while it may be easier to just snap back into our normal structures and routines, it is a moral imperative for us to continue to move down this road of shifting practices and policies that in fact are better for students. And once your eyes have been opened, it's hard to close them again and turn a blind eye to things that we know are actually causing harm to students. And I know as educators, we want our grades to hold meaning and value. We want the best for our students. And because we don't have the education and the research and the training, I mean, a lot of teachers that we work with in our work just don't know. And so we are moving the work forward, helping to educate and expand people's awareness to some of the practices that they may be using that may be causing harm without them even realizing it. Perfect segue.
Perfect. It's like we rehearsed.
So what are the grading practices that we know more than ever help to improve learning? I think it's important to recognize we want students' experience in school to be about the learning. If you're an educator on this chat, just drop in the chat if you have point hustlers in your classroom or even as a caregiver. If you know what a point hustler is and you've experienced that with students, or just drop in the chat. I know exactly what you're talking about. Yes, I see the laughing crying emoji. Yes, the grade chasers. I like that. I might have to borrow that one. We know those students, and I hate to say it, but we've created them. We have created the grade chasers and the point hustlers through our systems and structures. And so with that, we know that we need to move to practices that will actually move away from that. And so that means that we have to shift away from that 0 to 100 scale. We have to stop including participation and behaviors in the grade. And group grades, and then this is your extended learning opportunity. I want you to, at home, if you're a caregiver, ask your students how they feel about group grades. And as a teacher, I want you to go ask your students how they feel about group grades. We know we want to move away from these practices that don't work and are not producing the outcomes that we desire for students. And so we want to shift away from that. In our work, in our systems change partnerships, one of the things that we do is we interview students. And I think it was important that we bring their voices into this conversation. And so I have a couple quotes from students about some of these practices that we want to move away from. This one is about the 50 minimum, moving away from that 0 to 100 scale. Some teachers are doing that 50% where you can't go below a 50%. And seeing the F in a grade book can be, oh, I'm just not going to try. I'm already at an F. But I know if I was in that position, it would be super beneficial because you have a chance to improve. If you're at a 1%, what can you do? You're just not going to be able to make everything perfect and get your grade up to where you want it to be. But maybe if you see a 50, maybe I can get it up to a 55 or a 60. And then once you're getting those stepping stones, maybe that's the motivation you need to get to where you want to be. And so I think a teacher should start doing that, the 50% minimum. And this is showing students understand it is hard to come back from a zero. A zero is a hard hill to climb, and so they do just give up. And here's another one, and this particular one is regarding participation points. I have one teacher that does that participation points. She does it based on if we're putting our phones away during class. So she'll take points away if we don't put our phones away or she sees us on them. We start off with 100, and every time she sees us on our phone, she takes points away. So if you show up to class and get your work done, you earn the grade. But if you're on your phone, you're not earning full credit for showing up that day and getting the work done. Students understand. They want you to see what they know and can do. But here, this student is saying, hey, even if I know it and can do it, if I have that phone out, no one will know. And so the grade reflects that. So what we want to shift to is more equitable practices. And what does that look like? That looks like we have explicit learning outcomes for our students. That looks like us having rubrics that are very transparent and help students to know exactly what our expectations are, lifting the veil. That looks like retakes and redos. We want students, we say, it's okay to make mistakes, then that is what an equitable grading practice is. We want you to practice, learn, make mistakes, and then I'm going to give you an opportunity to retake or redo assessments, and expanding the use of formative feedback. And here our student voices enter into the room. Retakes, and this quote is from a student. I think that retakes are really helpful in some situations because sometimes you're not your best self. When you're taking a test, but that doesn't mean that you're not your best self when you're taking a test, but that doesn't mean you don't know the content. And that's from a high school study. Can't we all relate? Have we ever shown up to work and it's just not our best day? And aren't we glad that no one is taking points away? And here goes another one. This one is on rubrics. I think that rubrics can be really helpful if they're given out in advance before starting the assignment. You can look over it and get a sense of what you need to do to get a certain grade or what you need to do to complete the assignment fully and the best of your ability. That really helps because it gives students a sense of what the teacher is looking for, so you're just not in the dark. I love this because students across the nation have shared with us as we engage in this work. They have shared with us. They want to learn. They want to get feedback on what they're doing. They want to know how to be successful. And what we're doing is providing the structures and the system to allow them to do that. And so as we continue.
I'm sorry, Dr. Smith, I just want to let people know, she's just given you a taste of these things. And I'm just going to remind folks, there are 11 practices, can be more or less depending on how you combine them together. But these are all practices that are based on research that help support us being more accurate and bias resistant and motivational. And that was true before the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement. And it is just as true now.
Thank you so much, Joe. So how can we have more equitable grading? So one of the things that we found in our work is that we want teachers to really drive this work. This is not the traditional top-down, here's the thing, and you all go do it. No, what we do in our systems change partnership, and that we have seen to be effective in helping teachers to shift, especially when you're talking about something as difficult as changing beliefs. We found that it's important to allow them to go through this process. And so we have them develop which one of these practices do you want to work on? And we support them through this process by giving them specific workshops relating to things such as retakes and rubrics. And then they're trying these things out in their content and in their context. And in addition to that, we have, I think one of the critical pieces is you also have a thought partner. You have your own coach that helps you to bounce ideas off of. And what we've seen as we engage in this work, that's how you shift practices, because it's not coming as a directive. You're seeing for yourself. You don't get to stay in your head and be theoretical about this won't work, this won't work. You actually try it out and you know what works and what doesn't work, because it may look different in different content areas and different contexts. And so through this system and structures of support, we found that there has been so helpful in helping teachers to shift their practice. Did you want to add anything, Joe?
One of the things that we did see both prior to the pandemic and during and post is that oftentimes grading changes start with policy. It starts getting pushed from the top down, and that we have found to be the least effective way to change and improve the kind of grading practices that students experience. As Dr. Smith said, it's our work and our partnerships with schools and districts have found that when teachers get the support and they actually get to understand the why, what, and how of this work with support, they start to understand and recognize and realize the benefits. And it's when the teachers start doing these practices that the district or school develops a body of evidence that demonstrates the benefits of the practices that then can inform policy. So as we've seen people think about this, the success comes from teacher-driven and teacher-supported ways of improving grading, not from the top down.
And when districts do top down, some of our clients have come to us then and said, hey, we really messed up. Can y'all help us? Right? They're like, yeah, the top down stuff doesn't work. And like, yeah, we know. That's why we advocate against it. Here's some voices of teachers. We've had the voices of students in the room. I think that it's important to get the voices of my colleagues in the room as well. One kid started late in the class and was scoring low and was playing catch up. For the first time, I was giving him hope that he could still pass. And that's from a math teacher. And it makes a huge difference when you have kids who have hope in the classroom. They don't give up, and it changes the dynamic of the classroom. I like to say this all the time. We are hope dealers. Instead of having an adversarial relationship with students, we actually are giving them hope that they can and that they can be successful.
And I'll sort of as a transition, we have all kinds of data to show the benefits of these practices for students as well as teachers, but it's the stories that we hear from teachers and students about the hope that comes back into classrooms and students and teachers feeling like they are more human by doing these practices that is equally as fulfilling and supportive of this work. But for the folks who really need to feel confident that this work has an impact, wanted to talk about some of the quantitative data that we've found. And this is since starting the work in 2015-16 and continuing now. We see both a reduction in grade inflation from equitable grading and a reduction in grade deflation. So in other words, students aren't getting grades that are higher than their actual understanding of the course content because of other non-academic things or other ways of that traditional grading inflates grades. And they're also not being punished or having their grades being lowered for not doing certain things or behaving in certain ways that don't have anything to do with academic understanding. And although I don't love standardized tests, one of the things that's really been interesting is that we see a reduction in achievement disparities because of that in the grading, and we see a statistically significant increase in the relationship between the standardized tests that a student takes in a course and the grade that the teacher assigns in that course. They get closer together. And again, even though I don't love standardized tests, I'd rather the grades get closer than farther away. It builds confidence that the teacher's grade is more accurate and the test is more accurate actually too. So I wanted to talk about, lastly, a couple of kind of ideas in the air. As equitable grading has become more and more part of the ways teachers are thinking about improvements to classroom across the country, we're seeing some skepticism and pushback around this. And that's expected when you're trying to change a system that is actually more equitable and more fair. you get pushback. And so I want to highlight one of the ideas that has gotten some traction and just give my perspective and hopefully give some guidance to folks in the room who may be hearing the same kind of pushback. And the idea around grade inflation, right? That, well, if you're giving students more opportunities, or if you're having a minimum 50, or if you're using rubrics or whatever, you're making it easier, right? You're making success easier, which means that the integrity and accuracy of the grade has been compromised. And what we found is that equitable grading actually increases the level of rigor in the classroom. And teachers tell us this. They say that their classes have actually gotten more rigorous by using these practices because students can't compensate for lack of understanding the content through non-academic means, right? They can't say, well, I didn't learn this concept, but I'm going to make sure I raise my hand a lot to compensate for that because I can move the points from over here and push them over there. And for the teachers, it increases their focus on learning progress and outcomes. Teachers talk about how they don't have to quite do the same level of bean counting and policing of students through points and all this other kind of stuff that it's not germane to students' level of understanding of the course content. And therefore, when it's not included in the grade, they themselves as teachers can focus on the learning. This is from a world language teacher. I used to think that equitable grading made it easier for students to pass my class, but now I think it is fair and holds them accountable to their learning. When I tried out the new grading strategies, my students saw that it was not ever too late to succeed and there were fewer failing grades. I also had fewer A's because procedural compliance and homework completion no longer inflated grades. And I think this is the strongest counter argument, and actually we have it in the data, right? It makes learning, it's more purely about the learning, which increases rigor for every student, and it supports every student in ways that traditional grading has not. To close, I just want to talk about, and you may have heard this in Dr. Shantha Smith's way she talks about this work and what it has meant for her. And it's what a lot of teachers sort of express in more emotion than language, which is this is transformative work for us. We've never had opportunities to learn this content as teachers in our graduate schools or alternative certification programs. And now with access to this information and this research, things change for us. It's incredible to see the collaboration and continued conversation that has been happening in our equitable grading pilot. I can't recall a time I've seen this amount of collaboration and enthusiasm related to a single educational shift in my career. And this last quote from middle school teacher: I want people to understand the joy that can come back to teaching and learning and teaching through grading in these ways. I say that very purposefully because my colleagues and I have really found joy again in many of these new grading practices we've done. And so it is my hope and our work as an organization, Dr. Smith and me together with our team, that we give more people access to this way of understanding this critical aspect of their practice. Dr. Smith, any words before we pass it on to questions?
I just really appreciate, and I've heard from teachers on across the nation about the professionalism, like being back in charge of what is happening and thinking about some things that are more deeply rooted in instruction and the curriculum. Like we're actually talking about how do we increase learning? And I think teachers have found joy in that. And I have not forget a teacher who told me in Talbot County, she said, we've talked about equity a lot. This is the first time I'm actually doing it. Like, it's not just a talking point, it's actually me being engaged in the work. And so for some of my white colleagues who have done the books, read White Fragility or other ways that they've learned about the work, this is a way that you can actually take part in making this, joining this movement and this mission to help our students have better outcomes. And so that would be what I hope people are walking away with, that they can make a difference in our work and in our profession.
All right. So I will now pass it to Melissa. take it from here.
I have one question. So there was a lot of conversation in the chat about minimum scores for students, whether that's 50% or 0. And we had a question, what are folks' thoughts on the 50% versus the 59%? If we can still communicate the F and the numerical value is actually 59%, is it better for the student to leave it at 59 or the equivalent? This is getting into real nitty-gritties, but what do you two think?
You want me to go?
You can start.
I'll start.
We've never had that question before. No, we talk about it a lot in our work. So Dr. Smith. I think
that question speaks to, again, the idea that we're trying to manipulate the numbers to try to help convey a message. And typically I find when teachers are asking about that, it's typically around how do we note that maybe a student was absent and they're still getting the 50, right? So what kind of structures may be in place so that we can know that the 50 means you made an attempt versus you didn't come and do anything at all. So the 50% minimum is really done because of the gradations in the scale or not. We're trying to support the idea that we want those equal bands, those equal gradations between the 50 to 100, and knowing that a 0 really pulls your grade down. So that is the whole purpose of the 50 minimum, is so that we can have those equal gradations. And so by trying to manipulate to make it 59, actually is kind of still entering into the same territory, just from an opposite direction. And so I think that you have to ask yourself, what is the actual problem that you're solving for? And sometimes our grading systems allow us to put in something that will denote that they were absent. And so if it's about that, then we need to find a problem to solve for that particular thing instead of trying to manipulate the scale again. Joe, you want to add on to that?
Yeah, and it's very complex. And, I can point you to the book where I spent a lot of time talking about it, both from a mathematics perspective. So there's the architecture of the 0 to 100 scale is actually mathematically unsound when applied when you're trying to use sort of calculations with it. And Dr. Smith sort of referenced this, the sort of architecture of the way the scale is designed leads to disproportionately punishing for low grades. So you can look there. There's also a question about purpose, right? So if we're trying to motivate students, that's different than if we're trying to describe what they know, right? If you give a 0, no student knows nothing, right? So a 0 arguably is always inaccurately describing. The problem is you don't know what the student knows because they didn't do the thing or didn't turn in the assignment or the assessment. So you kind of have to start untying the knot of all of this, which is why what we find is most successful, even though it takes a little longer to get there, just sort of through trial and error and just thinking process, is to get to a 0 to 4 scale. The 0 to 4 has many, many superior aspects to the 0 to 100 scale, both mathematically and statistically, as well as sort of in communication, as well as accuracy. Like, it's far better than the 0 to 100. And it's the GPA scale anyway, so everybody knows what it is anyway. But we find that just in the ways that people go through this learning, because it is a long journey for this, is they have to sort of understand the flaws of the 0 to 100 scale, and that helps them get to the 0 to 4. So it is a difficult but very rewarding journey to figure out this darn scale.
Thank you. We had another question. Is there a specific place where I can find a summary of the research to prove that these practices work? And I'm going to go ahead and just drop the link for the Crescendo Ed Group results page. And I know you have a lot of the research there. If there's anything else you want to share about that, please go ahead.
Yeah. So I'll sort of talk about when people say research supporting, there's a couple aspects. One is what theoretical research in fields support this. So that I have an extensive bibliography in the book that shows what all these practices are based on. Then there's the research to show, like, well, these specific practices, and some of those are cited in the book, and some of those are on the website, and we also have data. We have a white paper that was published in 2018, and there's another one that's going to be published in a couple of months that shows some of that data. But we actually believe the best data is ones from your classroom, teachers in the room, or administrators from your teachers in your school or district, that I can tell you that the practices work, and I can even introduce you to a teacher who had it work, and you might say, well, those aren't my students, or that's not my community, and that may not work here. The only way to know is to start doing them. And if you can get the courage to try it on a really small scale, we find that teachers find benefits, and their own evidence, which is really the most convincing evidence you have, is your own.
Next question. I still get student pushback on assigning work that doesn't earn them points. I tell them if they're happy with their assessment grades, keep doing what they're doing. But how have people gotten students to do homework and behave in class when there are no points involved? Question of motivation.
You want me to take that?
It's your turn.
Oh, perfect. So one of the things that I will say to that particular question is it is a complex thing, right? One, grading for equity does not solve all problems in the classroom. So that's like a caveat, right? It doesn't solve everything. But what it does do is allow us to get clear on what we want students to know and can do. And more importantly, communicate that to students and show them the connection between practice and performance. I feel like one of the biggest things that I hear from students as across this nation, they say the performance and the practice are different, right? So sometimes it's a matter of the assessment, right? And how can I be motivated if I'm doing this and I show up over here and it's different, right? That's actually kind of demotivating, right? So it's not a comprehensive not a single answer, because this is a complex system. So is it that they get a lot of zeros and they have over time, they have given up on school because it has never been a place that has served them or rewarded them, right? So I wish there was one particular answer, and that is not even the way that we engage in this work. When we do our year-long partnerships, this is not a quick fix, and it is not a thing that you can say, here you go, do these things and your grading will be fixed. We don't have a magic wand. It really takes the hard work to actually do the deeper dive, because there are so many different factors that play into students' motivation. And first, what are the things that are causing them to be demotivated in the first place? Is it the points that they have never been able to get the points, so they don't want to play the game, right? Or is the learning not relevant to them and it's boring? Like, there's so many different factors that go into you can't even solve, and I won't even try here. I'll turn it over to Joe.
Oh, so I'm supposed to try and solve them.
You wrote the book. Joe has all the answers.
No, I really echo what Dr. Smith said. Like, there's things that we can use to better motivate students through intrinsic motivation. I mean, the evidence is overwhelming that extrinsic motivation does not improve thinking and learning, and critical ways that we want students to grow and be in our classrooms. Extrinsic motivation, the research tells us that it actually lowers performance to extrinsically motivate, right? So now we got to really rethink, like, how are we communicating to students? How are things like a redo or a retake going to start to shift the paradigm of what they think is supposed to happen in a classroom and what the teacher believes about them and what they're capable of, right? That's one example that starts to shift motivation. The changing the scale, where even if I haven't done well at the beginning, my grade average, or if I average, it is not so low that it's impossible mathematically for me to redeem myself, right? All these kind of little aspects start to shift ways that we think about what we do in a classroom and what students think they do and are capable of in a classroom. And there's lots of other parts of it also. It's a part of a comprehensive strategy.
I've got a couple more questions that I've taken note of. I'm going to skip around because there's another one about motivation. This was before you gave that answer, so I think you've already touched on some of it, but I've noticed that many students still tend to lack motivation in turning in late assignments or completing corrections with the 50% versus when we use zeros. Are there any tips for motivating them or ways teachers and administrators can build understanding in how we should be motivating them or partnering with parents? And I wanted to flag this one because we've talked about motivation, but we haven't touched on the parent part of this question yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of this, and we didn't talk about the importance of when grading is changed to be more equitable, more accurate, bias resistant, and motivational, there needs to be some specific energy put into caregiver and family communication and student communication and education for both of them. The parents and caregivers of our students have generally only experienced one type of grading, the traditional 100-year-old system, and probably have stories of the harms that it has done for them. And if we want to engage them as partners, we have to bring them into the conversation about what grading has been for them and their children, and how might these equitable grading practices actually benefit their child, regardless of their prior performance, right? I think a number of times we've heard from teachers and school and district leaders who talk about, well, I've got a lot of people in my district whose kids have done very well. They did well in the traditional system. Their kids have done well in the traditional system. They don't want any change at all, right? Why change the rules of a game that they know how to play and have been doing well in? And what we've helped them think about in their communication strategy is that they actually have been harmed. They've been successful and have been harmed in this system. And because the grade has represented their level of compliance in many ways, and it has blurred their level of actual understanding, it has actually been not serving them well. We have been setting up many students potentially to go to the next grade level or go to college or whatever and not be prepared because the grade has collapsed non-academic information in it. And finally, I'll say that one of the things that's really attractive to parents about this and families about this work is that it decreases stress in classrooms. You increase the rigor and decrease the stress, which seems counterintuitive. But it is by focusing on learning and not compliance and daily perfection, really, because oftentimes classrooms are performance spaces for students. By not having that be the case, you allow students to relax and bring more of their authentic selves into classrooms and allow them to be more successful than they would be in the past and to be more engaged with learning than they had been before.
Thank you. We have one more unanswered question if you all have a minute. I know we're at time, but what is the best practice when students do not complete any work at all? Do you still give a 50? Does that invite a bigger conversation about repeating the class because the student was not able to demonstrate evidence of mastery?
I think that one of the biggest points is that a 50 is still an F. A F is still failing. I think that what we've done in our traditional system is we have to, like, what's the difference between a 28 and a 39? Like, what is that? What does that even mean? I think that it's not like they're passing. It really just gives them an opportunity to come back from it. So given the 50 minimum still means that you don't have the understanding, or you have not been able to demonstrate your understanding of the skill or the learning target, but it doesn't mean you pass, right? And I think that what it does is, on the flip side, just give you hope that you can. And through the other systems and structures that we put in place, right? If we allow students to retake and redo our assessments, then the goal is that they won't stay at a 50. So that 50 will mean you absolutely did anything because you had an opportunity to show and demonstrate your learning and mastery.
Well, thank you, Joe and Dr. Smith, for this amazing presentation. And thank you to everybody who attended for your attention and engagement and insights. This was a really robust conversation that we were able to have. And so grateful that all of you took the time out of your day. And yes, this webinar will be sent to you via email, the recording, and it will also be up as a free resource on the Corwin website and on YouTube. So it's not a gated piece of content, and we encourage you to share it widely if you got something out of it today. So thank you all, and hopefully we'll see you all again sometime soon.
Melissa, can I just say one last thing? I want to say thank you to all of our teachers around the nation who are engaging and partnering with us in this work. It means so much to me, and I know, Joe, that we have other people engaging in this work. I saw a guy, Jeff, in the chat who mentioned he was alone in this work, and it's no fun being an island. So even though we're not like literally beside you, just know we stand arm in arm as we move this work across the nation. I just want to say thank you to everyone.
And if there's anything we can do to help support you, please reach out to us. Like, that is our mission, is to support teachers and schools and leaders in this work. So please reach out, because we want to help in this difficult journey.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.